Can you imagine a publishing company contacting you out of the blue and asking you to write a book? That's exactly what happened to today's guest. Welcome to the Genealogy Professional Podcast, the resource for transitional and experienced genealogists who want to create a successful business. I'm your host, Miriam Pierre-Louis. Here you'll learn from professionals all around the world who work in the field of genealogy. Are you ready to get started? Then let's get going. Welcome to the Genealogy Professional Podcast. Today we head to Maryland to talk to genealogist Brian Sheffey. Brian is a writer and speaker and visual storyteller. He is the author of the book Practical Genealogy, 50 Simple Steps to Research Your Diverse Family History. He's also co-host of the Genealogy Adventures YouTube show. Brian, welcome to the Genealogy Professional Podcast.
Hi, and thank you very much for having me on the show. I'm really looking forward to us having a good chat.
Let's start with how and when did you get interested in genealogy?
It was about 2008, 2009. I was coming up to my father's 78th, 79th birthday. So I phoned my mom to get some ideas about presents that I could buy my dad. And it was really funny because they were downsizing. And my mom just basically said, look, do not buy your father anything. She's like, we just don't have space in the house for another thing. So I thought I just got the idea because his parents divorced when he was really quite young. He really didn't know that much about his father's side of the family. So I thought I'd kill two birds with one stone, give him a really personalized birthday present in the form of his genealogy. And in the same time, I actually got to learn about a side of the family that even I didn't really know that much about.
Well, so how old were you at that time?
Ooh, that is a good question. I was coming I must have been in my mid to late 30s.
And were you surprised by anything that you found?
Well, I guess for him it was kind of bittersweet because one, I was able to just push his Sheffey family line all the way back to an enslaved ancestor who was born about 1800. And as a newbie genealogist, I just didn't really know what to expect. So I was really pleased to be able to do that. But the bittersweet part for him was he actually found out that he had aunts and uncles that he didn't know anything about who were alive and well up until he must have been about 25 or 26 when the last of them actually passed on. And the amazing thing was actually reaching out to the extended family that still live in Virginia. They actually have photographs of him. So they were very, very generous and very sweet in sending me all of these photographs of all of his aunts and uncles.
I'm going to dig into your background just a little bit, okay? Because I know that you're from Connecticut, and we have a couple things in common. I'm from Connecticut, you're from Connecticut. Turns out you went to the University of Connecticut, and I went to the University of Connecticut virtually at the same time. But I know that you also lived in London for a long time.
So I am Connecticut born and bred. I didn't actually move to London until it was about a week after I graduated from UConn.
Yeah, how did you get to London for so long?
Well, we have a mutual friend called Moira,
Mm-hmm.
and she, myself, and another one of our friends who was living in North Campus at UConn, we decided we were going to treat ourselves, and we were going to spend 6 months living in London. And after about 2 months, I loved it. I actually felt like I was home. In a weird way, England felt more like a home than America did. And again, I don't really want to get into like a whole lot of racial stuff, but for the first time in my life, I actually felt as though I was being kind of seen and judged on me, my personality, my characteristics, my talents, my experience, rather than my skin color. So Moira and our mutual friends came back to the States, and I stayed. And the usual story, boy meets girl, boy and girl fall in love. Before you know it, we were married, and we were pretty much settled in England.
All right. So you married a British woman.
I did indeed.
To catch our audience up to speed, I was a study abroad student in London for a year, and this friend Moira happened to be my roommate. And then we both went back to the United States, and then she went back to England with Brian and was his roommate again in England. So that's the ironic coincidence is that we have the very unique ability to say that we have both been Moira's roommate in London. Yeah.
I know, and I keep saying it's such a crazy small world.
Yeah. And we became Facebook friends before I even realized that. Though if I had looked at the mutual friends and things like that, I would have realized it, but maybe I did. Who knows?
Well, it's like genealogy. It was just one of those out of the blue kind of discoveries.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, so you're in your 30s, you're in London when you start digging into your family history. And so then what happens? You do this present for your dad, and you find these ancestors and these living relatives in Virginia. Do you just keep doing genealogy at this point, or does it start to take over your life? I mean, what happens with you and your relationship with genealogy?
I am going to say that genealogy pretty much hijacked me at that point. Because basically, to begin with, and it's something that I would suggest to any newbie genealogist, is I just stayed on my father's direct line, his direct paternal line. So I just wanted to get a sense of what kind of record sets were out there, what kind of books were out there, kind of, plus I was learning how to do genealogy, kind of slowly discovering what the whole best practice of genealogy was, things like citations, crediting other people's work, all those myriad of things that are kind of categorized under genealogical standards of proof, to make sure that you're putting the right record with the right person and all of that. So pretty much for about a good 9 months, like I said, I literally stayed on his direct line. When I felt confident and comfortable, that's when I started looking at my, X-time great-grandparents' siblings and tracing their descendants and kind of building it out. So that probably took me for about another year. And then I was off. I was like literally off at the races, started working on my mother's side of the family. And before you knew it, I was probably spending a good 35 to 40 hours a week doing genealogy.
That's a lot.
I kind of laugh. I guess it's the kind of brain that I have. I love puzzles. I love mysteries. I love doing things like Sudoku. And if you love doing those kinds of things, and if you, also enjoy reading about history and making historical discoveries, genealogy is perfect for all of that.
And when you dove into your mother's ancestry, was her family also from Virginia?
My mom her ancestry is very different. So the core of her ancestry is South Carolina. It's a part of South Carolina called the Old 96 District. But her family's earlier origins are split out between Bermuda on the enslaved side, as well as North Carolina, and then some of those lines go back to Virginia too. I don't know how I would explain this to them if they were both alive, but my mother and my father are distantly related quite a few times over.
Mm. Okay. So many people come to genealogy from a different profession. What were you doing before genealogy took over your life?
My first job in Britain was actually in advertising. I was working for a company called Saatchi and Saatchi, and then started working for other advertising agencies. Kind of got a little bit bored doing that, but it was a brilliant experience, especially when it comes to writing, because I guess the entirety of my career is kind of defined by stringing words together. I ended up becoming owning half of a record label, kind of handling all the marketing and promotion and advertising for our roster of artists. And I was doing that alongside teaching marketing at university and doing genealogy. You're getting a sense that I really like to stay busy. That's probably a good summation.
I think that most genealogists are like that. They just have their fingers in everything.
Especially at the moment, Maryland is still very much, well, it's partially open, but the part that I live in is still kind of closed down. So there's never a dull, I'm never bored. So even if, having to stay home,
Yep.
just sit there and kind of do genealogy.
Yeah. And I just want to, for posterity's sake, I want to say closed down due to coronavirus, because somebody listening to this 4 years from now might not remember. So,
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
yep. Yep. Always thinking that way. Yep. Thinking about everybody who's going to listen 3 generations from now. All right. So, how did you make the transition from marketing music exec to full-time genealogist? What was going through your head that said, I really need to do this? Because it doesn't, for a normal logical person would look at you and say, that doesn't make any sense.
I'm going to say, on the one hand, the sense of satisfaction or achievement that I had being able to really push my family's ancestry just back to the earliest part of the foundation of America. The people that I was meeting, and at some point, because my ancestry is so mixed. I mean, there's Jewish, there's Native American, there's free people of color, there's enslaved Africans, the first Europeans to ever step foot on this in North America. I thought I really need to start writing this down and kind of sharing this information outside of the family. And as my skills developed and I started kind of developing out of the box thinking in terms of, I call them poorly documented ancestors. So whether they were enslaved, whether they were kind of white European settlers in Tennessee and Kentucky, I thought, I need to just kind of sit down, kind of talk about research strategies, approaches that I've kind of developed myself for breaking through brick walls and kind of share that with people. And those first couple of posts just really took off. People there just seemed to be a hunger for it. And I guess I discovered what you call a niche and kind of quickly filled it.
And that niche is?
I'm going to call it multi-ethnic genealogy with a specialism in finding poorly documented ancestors.
As you are transitioning more and more into genealogy, what does that look like? Are you writing articles, and that's how are you getting those published, and what steps are you taking?
Well, I developed a website called genealogyadventures.net, and that's pretty much where I publish all of my writing. I don't do as much writing as I'd like to, or that I used to, because now we have a Genealogy Adventures show, which streams live on the internet, which I do present with my cousin and co-host Donnie Williams. And again, that's filled with kind of useful tips, approaches to different kinds of genealogy, different approaches to genealogy. So that's kind of filled the gap with my lack of writing. But I put the caveat, I really, really do hope I can start publishing more kind of research articles at least once a week.
And do you want to publish for any magazines or journals?
I do that. I do get asked from time to time. As a matter of fact, I've just written an article for, I can't remember the name of it, but it's a pretty well-known genealogy journal in Louisiana. And that should be coming out in a couple of months.
And I'm assuming you have Louisiana ancestry, and would be the connection.
Actually, funnily enough, no. But I do have members of both my parents' enslaved families, extended families, who were taken to Louisiana.
So what does your work situation look like now? And because this is many people who listen to this show are aspiring professionals, and the reality is not all professionals work full-time. So do you work full-time in genealogy, or do you also do something else at the same time?
I periodically still teach marketing. We do paid research for people. As I said, Callista Media, who's the publisher of Practical Genealogy and the Family Tree Workbook, which comes out on the 2nd of June. It's just a book of a lot of different kind of forms that people can use to document their research. That kept me busy because Callista gave me about 12 weeks to write 2 books.
Really?
So, yeah, that kept me crazy busy.
Okay, so besides the occasional marketing teaching, you're doing genealogy full time, pretty much. That's what it sounds like.
That's right. And now that it looks as though we're going to be getting sponsorship for the show, that's kind of a salary as well. So
wow, that's awesome.
That's great.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. All right, so let's dive into Callista Media. You already mentioned their name, so it's not a problem to talk about them. Writing books is of something that's of interest to our audience. So how did that come about? Did you contact them and say, hey, I've got an idea for a book? Did they contact you because they saw your website or your YouTube channel? How did that work out?
I was really, really blessed. I'm going to say that. Callista works in a very interesting way. They look at key phrases that people search online. So, they're looking at search phrases on Bing, on Google. You've seen the big internet searches. And then they try to find the theme behind them. And they basically develop books based on their market research. So they were very keen to do something on genealogy. They weren't quite entirely sure what they wanted, but they knew the genre that they wanted to write for. And they did some searches, and Genealogy Adventures kept popping up. So they're like, maybe we should get in touch with this guy. And they did. Out of the blue, they sent me an email. How would you like to write some books for us?
What is the specialization of Callista Media? Because usually most publishing houses focus on one thing or other.
Their authors, well, the people they approach to write books, come from a wide variety of backgrounds. So the same month that they're publishing my genealogy books, they've published books on chess, backgammon, just those kind of things. I guess their key kind of differentiation is the amount of kind of market research that they do, and then their price point. Because we agreed practical genealogy could be twice the length that it is, but in publishing, the more pages you have, the more expensive the book becomes. So that was kind of really a constraint for us. They're very aware of their price point. They wanted someone who could write a book in a very conversational tone, and they said that's what they really loved about the Genealogy Adventure articles on the website. They're like, yeah, we could just imagine you explaining genealogy like you were in a pub in Cornwall or London, just kind of, chatting about, oh, well, how do I find death records? So they were very keen to have a very kind of chatty tone. And their big influence is inclusivity. So they want, where possible, they wanted gender neutral language, which with genealogy was that was an interesting conversation to have. So for instance, we were chatting about certain records like birth records. Some of the suggestions being bounced back and forth was, well, instead of using mother and father, what about person one, person two? And I'm like, well, I see where you're going. I don't really think that fits comfortably within genealogy up to now. Who knows what's going to happen in the future, just because family dynamics are changing.
Right.
What we consider as the, and I'm using air quotes if you can imagine that, the traditional family, that model has really changed. But I really enjoyed that conversation with them because I think that's going to open up an interesting conversation within genealogy. Like, how are people going to document that?
What did you end up deciding for that particular discussion? You can't get away from mother father in genealogy. So did you guys compromise on that?
So in practical genealogy, it's mother and father.
Okay.
In the family tree workbook, most of the forms do say mother and father, but there are what we call the blended family worksheets, where you have person one, person two. So where we could do it, we did it. Where it made sense to do it, we did it. But other than that, then it's just the traditional phraseology.
The short of it is there's a lot of family dynamics going on out there. With Callisto, did they talk to you about practical genealogy first, or did they also talk to you about the family tree workbook, or did they come to you and say, hey, let's do both?
They said, let's do both.
Oh.
Let's work out a way that we can do both. I wrote practical genealogy first. We just figured that would be the best way forward. But what they did do is give me what a kind of a rough outline of the kind of content that they wanted to have for both books. We focused more on practical genealogy because that was the first one that was going to be released. And again, just such a really good conversation with them and, bless them. They made it so much easier for me to be able to write kind of two books in tandem. As I said, especially with the 12-week deadline. They were very receptive to the changes that I wanted to make to practical genealogy. So the changes that I had suggested was having more chapters on African American, specifically to African American genealogical research, and a little bit about Native American research in there too, which wasn't on the original kind of content list. And they, as I said, all credit to them. They took all the suggestions on board. They were really open to the whole process, and I think we've all kind of agreed coming out of it that it's a much stronger book.
So if somebody with Hispanic background or somebody with Asian background sees your book and they see the tagline 50 simple steps to research your diverse family history, are they going to find things about their family experience in it as well, or is it more focused on sort of like white, black, mixed families?
It's more focused on white, well, I'm going to say European, African descended, and a nice little bit about Native American ancestry. Unfortunately, we did have a conversation about trying to include other groups because I'm Jewish as well. I've got a Jewish great grandfather, but I am so new to Jewish genealogy. I'm still learning about that. That was outside of my comfort zone. I felt it would be disrespectful because I just don't have those kind of insights into, I suppose, ethnicities that aren't part of my own
Mm-hmm.
genetic makeup, the kind of research that I've never done before. I guess for the book, up to about 1870, you're going to be accessing the same record sets no matter what your ethnicity is. But obviously, if you're a Chinese American and your ancestor came here to work on the railroads, that's going to entail not a different viewpoint, but it's going to require a different strategy because I couldn't even begin to tell you how well documented Chinese immigrants coming into America during that time period is. I have no idea what kind of forms they had to fill in, what kind of records exist for
Mm-hmm.
them. With a 12-week turnaround, there just wasn't time to research that.
Your title is 50 Simple Steps to Research Your Diverse Family History. And without reading a paragraph, a description about the
Mhm.
book, I want to just get an idea of how diverse we're talking about.
Well, what we did do is, at least on Amazon, the table of contents is up there on the book page.
Mhm.
So people can just scan through both of those images, and they'll see exactly what's inside the book.
All right. So, had you ever worked with book publishers before? So you already had knowledge to draw on, or did you? There's a lot of stuff you have to learn. I've never worked with a book publisher, so I don't know, but I do know others who have worked with publishers, and there's a lot of stuff you have to get up to speed quickly, like contracts and
Royalties.
royalties, that's it. Royalties, and it's just sort of a different business model than like, other businesses. So did you come to this project with some knowledge of this, or did you have to get up to speed really quickly to protect yourself and make sure you're getting a fair deal and all that kind of stuff?
Very good question. So I'm lucky that I had a couple of decades worth of experience in the music industry, and especially with music publishing. So believe it or not, there's a lot of parity between those two industries and those two kinds of contracts. So I was kind of well versed already. I also have an amazing entertainment lawyer who's in London. So she kindly read over the contract, and there was nothing onerous in there. And as well, these are classed as work for hire. So even though I've written them, it's like Callista Media actually owns them. So
Interesting.
they paid me a flat fee
Okay.
to write them, which
And
for me was fine.
is there any money after, or is it just a flat fee?
For these two, there's just a flat fee.
Just
We have discussed about what's going to happen if there's future books, but for these two, it was a flat fee, which I'm going to say as a new author, because it's a big difference between writing articles. I don't want to say published online because that sounds as though they're kind of diminished, but you know what I mean. There's a
Mhm.
big difference between writing short form articles and writing a book.
Mhm.
I'm going to say that Callisto also, they just made the experience as simplified as they possibly could. They even told me how they wanted to have the manuscript submitted. So I didn't have to worry about any of that. They told me, please use this font, make sure that there's this kind of line spacing. All of that was kind of taken care of. I didn't have to think about any of that. I just had to do it the way that they wanted it done.
And where's your book sold?
It's available for sale. Well, again, because of COVID, a lot of the bookstores are actually shut, but it will be in bookstores, I promise you. I have to, I feel so bad for them because they've just got boxes of these things in the warehouse at the moment. But both online and offline, it's available at Barnes& Noble, Target, Walmart, and it's obviously available for sale on Amazon and a lot of other places. I'm trying to do a mental inventory, but I know those are the kind of big places people can buy them from.
So, what's the breakdown between you and Callisto when it comes to marketing and publicity? Because they're a really unique publisher, and most mainstream publishers, they're outside of the genealogy space, but they're even further out than that because of this unique system that they've developed. So I don't expect that I would ever see them going to a genealogy conference to promote the book. So is there any sort of agreement between you and them, or any expectation on their part that you're going to do in-person promotion of this book?
Well, funny you should mention that. And again, sorry to keep chatting about COVID, but COVID-19 really has changed our world. So when Callisto and I first started speaking back in, that must have been October, either the end of December or the beginning of October, we had a whole list of things that we wanted to achieve. Some of that was speaking at conferences, which is something that I do anyway, but at least having a brand new book published, there was more of an opportunity to speak at other conferences, like the National Genealogical Society, for instance. They were going to pitch me to be able to speak there. Unfortunately, all of my conference speaking is just gone. It's just evaporated at the moment because of, social distancing and
Right.
everything that goes with that. While that's kind of gone, I mean, we've just continued to do a really big kind of online push. They've been amazing in terms of working with Amazon, making sure that, the Amazon advertising is running and that it's effective and that it's everything is running smoothly.
I noticed that you have a project called Stronger Together, the story of us, and it's with you, period, S period. So what is this project all about?
I'm really glad you asked that question. It's the first time I've actually been interviewed about that. So, on my father's ancestry, his roots go back to the foundation of Jamestown. So, on the one hand, we're descended from the Pamunkey tribe that was in that part of Virginia. Also, the first British settlers of Jamestown. So, we're talking John Rolfe, just that whole, Dr. Woodson, that whole crew, and literally the first Africans who were kind of like bonded servants that arrived from Angola into Virginia in 1619, 1620. And the cool thing is, working with the genetic genealogists that we have as part of the Genealogy Adventures team in London, we were able to stitch together a lot of that really, really early but poorly documented ancestry in that part of Virginia. And really, the story of the beginning of part of the United States is literally encoded not only in just my DNA, but in the DNA of a number of people. And I thought it would be a really good way to kind of frame a conversation about multi-ethnicity in America, as well as kind of talking about having a really honest conversation about American history, or at least the American history that happened in Maryland and Virginia in that really early period. Because some of the things that I've noted, which again I cover in the book, is a lot of my ancestral lines, their descendants today would be stunned to find out what their ancestors looked like and who they were previously. And by that I mean I get contacted a lot by DNA cousins who are mystified because they don't understand why they have like 1% sub-Saharan African, 2% sub-Saharan African. And my question is, well, do you have any known connections to Virginia and specifically to places, counties like Varina, Powhatan, all around, Northern Neck? And they're like, yeah, I do actually. And it's like, well, you probably, not only do you have African DNA, you probably have Native American DNA, and just kind of explaining how those three people, especially if you were a poor white indentured European working in Jamestown alongside a Native American and and a bonded African, they worked together, they played together, they loved together, they sometimes escaped together. There was a really close bond between the three because they understood they shared the same experience. They weren't one of the Burgess class. They weren't one of the, the kind of landed, aristocratic class. They were all poor and they were all, hardworking. They kind of created this really kind of rich, vibrant, multi-ethnic community. Of course, as we know, American history kind of changed after Bacon's rebellion in 1697, and the three groups kind of went their separate ways. But really, it's the Stronger Together kind of project. It's really special to my heart because I think it's a really unique way to talk about really early American history. We're so focused on the genealogy and the
Okay.
DNA work at the moment. I hope in 2021 we'll have enough content to be able to put up, on a website.
I think for people to understand their ancestry and how it came about, it's absolutely critical that they understand the history, as you were suggesting, that took place at that time. And people have this sense that they know American history, but it changed so rapidly all through time. So I'm just going to put a plug here for a book. If you identify with what Brian is talking about from that time period in that part of the country. There's a book called American Colonies, The Settling of North America by Alan Taylor. This is actually like, they read it in school. My son was required to read this book, and the tactic in my house is I read all the books first and then the history books, and then make sure that they read them. But anyways, this book really goes into describing what you're talking about. And actually in this book was created to sort of better represent everyone who was existing at that time in early America. I don't know if you've read that book, but you should put that on your list.
No, I will do. I've made a note.
Yeah, American Colonies, The Settling of North America by Alan Taylor. It's a big 500-page book. You don't need to read the whole thing, but read those chapters that relate to you. But for anyone identifying with what Brian's talking about, well, actually anyone who has ancestors that go back to colonial America, you should read this book. And boy, won't it. Like, I think I'm smart. I think I know my history, but I didn't know anything about the South. And every colony, every now state in the South was like completely separate and run differently than the others. And it's a huge eye-opener for me. And of course, I know about New England, but, people from the South might not realize that New England was very different in the colonial times as well. So definitely, I highly recommend that book.
Because I've learned more about American history doing genealogy than I actually did when I was in school. Our colonial ancestors were a really, really rowdy bunch. I mean, I read how Virginia didn't like how Maryland was being run, so they overthrew the
Right.
Maryland colonial government. South Carolina didn't like how Georgia was running itself, so South Carolina overthrew the Georgia colonial government. I'm like, you guys were like not only feisty, you were rowdy.
Yeah, and one of the things that really surprised me about American history as well is how business-like it was. American history in school makes it seem like, the Pilgrims wanted their religious freedom, so they came over. They didn't mention that there were radicals or extremists or anything like that. Not really. But
Well,
anyways, the business aspect of it, the South is all business,
well, as much as genteel cavalier gentlemen could actually do business, but I get what you're saying.
I mean, it was all about, come over, start the businesses,
Well, I'm going to tell you the biggest shock that I had with researching Puritans, because I have Quaker ancestry too, predominantly in Pennsylvania, but some of them were in Massachusetts. They didn't fare so well.
New England is my specialty, so you're hard pushed to talk to me about New England, but get me out of New England, and I don't know what I'm talking about. So forgive everybody who's listening if I say something. But yeah, so there's a really good book by a woman named Diane Rappaport. She's here in New England, here in Massachusetts, and she's a lawyer turned genealogist. So everybody's a something turned genealogist, and she wrote a book called The Naked Quaker, and that was one of their forms of protest, was to turn up at church naked. That's one. And so being a lawyer, Diane based her book on all of these. They're all trial records and in court cases, these stories. So it's a book of stories about the Quakers, and it's called The Naked Quaker. Definitely a great read for anybody who's interested. Yeah. So you should read that if you have Quaker ancestors.
Oh, absolutely. But the funny thing was, I knew when I was taught about Puritans was that, they were pure, they were chaste, they didn't get up to mischief or anything like that. And then I'm starting to look at these marriage records and then comparing them to the date of or at least the year of the birth of their first child. And I'm looking and I'm like, oh, okay, so you got married in August of, 1692. Oh, look at that, you had a baby in December. How did that work? Going, yeah, that's not 9 months. That's not even 10 months. So it's like, oh, okay. So you were just kind of as fallible as anyone else was then.
Yeah, it's complicated.
But they were doing the same thing in Virginia. Again, looking at my European kind of Virginian ancestors. And this is like the top 2% of Virginia society. So again, making the assumption, our colonial ancestors were so well behaved. I'm like, oh, okay, you're having kids like 6 months after you got married. Oh, look at you, 7 months after you got married. I'm like, oh, okay, I know exactly what was happening.
Yeah, I don't think our colonial ancestors were so well behaved. I think people get blinded by the Victorian era, and then they project that onto our colonial ancestors, and it's just not the case.
No, and again, judging by my Quaker ancestors who got thrown out of the Quaker faith for drinking and fighting.
That's
I just look at the
amazing.
records. I look at
That's
the records, and it's like, oh, so and so was disowned for drunkenness and being disorderly. I'm like, oh, okay.
interesting. All right, that brings us, I think, to your YouTube channel, which is called Genealogy Adventures. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. And you co-host that with Danya Williams. So tell us a little bit about that. What made you decide to do a YouTube channel? And what do you focus on?
All credit to my co-host, Danya, as I mentioned before, who's also a cousin on my mom's South Carolina side of the family. She was asking me had I thought about developing the Genealogy Adventures website even further by doing a podcast. And I'm like, I don't know. I kind of felt it and I kind of didn't, and we were kind of bouncing the idea back and forth. I'm like, how would it work? How often would we do it? How long should it be? And what would the format be? And after about, 6 weeks of bouncing ideas back and forth, it all just kind of fell into place. And I thought, oh, you know what? That actually would be really good. I think in the beginning, I was really reluctant to be that public because again, for us, it's actually a video broadcast. So it's like our faces and everyone's going to know our names. And I had to kind of go through a kind of reassurance process that, we weren't going to get heckled or abused, or we're living in a really weird time socially and politically, everything, culture wars and all the rest of it. And I was thinking, do I really need to put myself up for that? But, we decided to, we bit the bullet and we decided to do it.
Is it just a YouTube channel, or is it released as a podcast as well?
It's released as a podcast as well. Actually, we do it through Facebook Live first on our Facebook Genealogy Adventures page. Then we upload an on-demand version onto YouTube. Then there's, we just upload the same file to like SoundCloud and iTunes, and it just kind of gets populated everywhere.
So where does your feedback come from the most from your audience? Is it from Facebook Live? Is it from the podcast distribution channels, or is it from YouTube?
I would say at the moment, our largest initial audience is always on Facebook Live because people can actually comment and ask questions in real time. That a lot of, we will read out and we'll comment on air, when we're interviewing people. YouTube has really kind of taken off over the last 6 months. So again, a lot of people are starting to leave comments, they're asking questions, they're sharing and they're commenting. A little bit less so on the kind of the strictly audio podcasts. I mean, people are liking them, they're sharing them, but they don't tend to. That seems to be the least interactive out of all of our platforms. And in terms of the show content, it's pretty wide ranging. I mean, we talk about different aspects of genealogy, kind of how people can research. We have specialists come on to talk about their tips and tricks. You're asking about different ethnicities in the book. The show is a much wider process, kind of wider discussion format. So we've had people, real subject experts talk about Caribbean genealogy, Latinx genealogy, Jewish genealogy. We're actually actively looking for someone to speak about East Asian American genealogy as well, because we realize that's a subject that we haven't touched on that we really would like to have on the show. We talk about American history. We talk about race issues. So it's kind of a very wide range kind of online magazine discussion format.
Sounds great. I checked it out on YouTube, but I didn't realize that it was also Facebook Live, that it had started as Facebook Live. So that's very interesting. I will have to check it out over there. What is in your future, Brian? Where do you go from here?
I can almost predict another book. Actually, well, definitely there's going to be another book because Genealogy Adventures has been going for 10 years. And next year we're going to be publishing a kind of best of genealogy adventures, kind of coffee table book. So it'll be a combination of new writing, old writing, all that kind of a thing. There may be a TV show, but I don't really want to say too much about that because I don't want to jinx it.
Yeah, don't jinx yourself. Nope.
That's kind of been our goal for the last 18 months, and we're getting what I call tickles of interest.
Mhm. Great. Excellent. All right. I think, Brian, it is time now to enter the lightning round. This is where I ask you a bunch of questions quickly, and you give us answers that'll help our audience with some of the burning questions they have about their genealogy future. All right, so here we go. What was the one thing you were most afraid of in starting your business?
I would have to say, why would anyone listen to something that I had to say? Specifically being someone that they had probably never heard of before.
What is the best advice you've ever received from someone else?
If you use any material from another genealogist or researcher, make sure you credit them.
Good advice. Yep. What is one specific action listeners can take in the next 24 hours to help them transition into a genealogy career?
I would say, where at all possible, see if you can fill a niche within the market. So that's like try to discover or decide if you have a specific or special area of research that you can share and people would be interested in.
If you can recommend one book for our listeners, what would it be?
I'm going to have to say a book by Catherine I. Knight, and it's called Unveiled, the Tale of the 1619 Africans in Virginia. Superb book.
Give our audience one parting piece of advice and then tell us how we can get in contact with you.
My best advice, and this is what I actually give my genealogy clients, do not do genealogy unless you are fully prepared to be able to handle the truth. We like to think that our ancestors led perfect, blemishless lives. Some of them did, some of them didn't. But go into it with an open mind, and whatever you find out is what you find out.
Tell us how we can get in contact with you.
So you can get in contact with me. All of my contact details are on Genealogy Adventures, all one word, .net. Our Twitter feed is Genealogy Advents. Facebook is Facebook.com/Genealogy Adventures. So pretty much we're all over social media. Some variation of the phrase Genealogy Adventures is pretty much our username.
Brian Sheffey, thank you for coming on the Genealogy Professional Podcast.
And thank you so much for the lovely invitation. This has really been a pleasure.
What I love about interviewing guests for this podcast is that each genealogy professional is so uniquely different from everyone else. Today we learned about Brian Sheffey's search into his own background, which turned out to be very diverse, including enslaved ancestors, Jewish, European immigrant ancestors, and even some Native Americans. That led him to start a blog, which then brought Callista publishers to his door asking him to write a book. The thing I find fascinating is the 2-book project was work for hire. Brian doesn't own the copyright. You might think that is a bad idea, but for a first-time author, that is a great way to get published and get paid while taking very little risk. Going forward as a known and published author, he's in a better position to go the more traditional route with confidence of how the reading public will respond to his work. I'm not advocating for either way, but I do think his decision-making logic was sound. We also learned about his Stronger Together, the Story of Us project about Jamestown, which he uses as a way to frame a conversation about multi-ethnicity. The thing that struck me from that discussion is just how critical it is to understand the social and historical context of the times your ancestor lived in. Don't make presumptions about what you think you know. Seek out historical works that will explain the culture and historical events of the time. Now for news items this week. Last month, I purchased a new piece of equipment for my podcasting setup that I'm very excited about. It's an audio recorder called the Zoom H6. I had posted on my personal wall on Facebook about my excitement and how this recorder was going to help me improve the sound quality of the podcast. One of my friends responded by asking if I would start a Patreon page so that she could help contribute to the equipment fund of the podcast. First off, let me say thank you for wanting to contribute. I really appreciated that. But for various reasons, I'm not comfortable creating an ongoing system like the one that you find on Patreon. I did give it quite a bit of thought, though, and I came to this conclusion. If you'd like to contribute to supporting the podcast, then I would ask that you recommend me as a virtual speaker to your local library, historical, or genealogical society. Any money earned from that now goes directly to supporting my podcast. I'm still in the process of creating an updated list of available talks, but here are 5 titles to choose from. 1. Discovering online oral history and audio collections to enrich your research. 2. Use your genealogy skills to discover the history of the people who lived in your house. Basically a house history talk. 3. Verifying information you find online. 4. 5 steps to becoming a good ancestor. And 5. How to capture and preserve oral history right now. You can find more details about this in the show notes at thegenealogyprofessional.com. If you want to connect with me, join me on Facebook in the TGP Action Group. You can comment, share your expertise, and ask questions. Search for the TGP Action Group on Facebook or find the URL in the show notes. If you're not on Facebook, follow the Genealogy Professional on LinkedIn. You can get new episode notices there. Go to LinkedIn and search for the Genealogy Professional and hit the follow button. And of course, don't forget, you can now find the Genealogy Professional podcast on Spotify and YouTube. That's it for this time. Until we meet again, keep improving your business skills and take at least one step to push your business forward. The Genealogy Professional Podcast is a production of Fieldstone Common Media. Copyright 2020. Executive producer, Miriam Pierre-Louis. Creative producer, George Edwards. Technical director, Jean-Luc Pierre-Louis Jr.